I watched him from my kitchen window, the house dark around me, sipping a warm cup of chamomile tea. It was 3 in the morning. Outside, in the pouring rain, my neighbor, Arthur, was on his hands and knees. He was weeping, his shoulders shaking violently as he frantically clawed at his own lawn with a rusted garden trowel, throwing chunks of wet sod over his shoulder like a manic dog. His wife stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her voice lost to the wind as she begged him to come inside. He ignored her, entirely consumed by his madness. To anyone else, it was a tragic mental breakdown. To me, it was a masterpiece. But to understand how a quiet, law-abiding man like myself pushed his neighbor to the absolute brink of sanity, we have to go back 3 months. I live in a quiet, unincorporated pocket of the county. Most of the folks here are the independent, quiet types, the kind of people who buy a home specifically to be left alone. We don't have street lights. We don't have paved sidewalks. And most importantly, we don't have a homeowners association. Some people might call our neighborhood slightly unkempt. I just call it peaceful. And then there was Arthur. Arthur was a retired corporate accountant who possessed an almost pathological obsession with order. His house stood out like a sterile, geometric anomaly. His lawn didn't look like grass. It looked like a green, carpeted prison cell. Cross, cut into perfect, alternating stripes with specialty roller attachments on his commercial mower. He spent his weekends measuring his shrubs with a ruler to ensure geometric symmetry. Naturally, Arthur was a twit, because he couldn't stand the beautiful, chaotic freedom of our street. He spent his first year here trying to organize a homeowners association. He drafted bylaws, held meetings that nobody attended, and knocked on doors trying to convince us that a governing body was exactly what our quiet lives needed. We politely, but firmly, told him to pound sand. Unfortunately, the lack of an actual HOA didn't stop Arthur from pretending he was the president of one. Every single time I dragged my old, squeaking mower out to chop down the mix of dandelions and clover that passed for my yard, Arthur would appear at the property line. He'd stand there like a sentinel, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tightly clenched. I'd try to ignore him, keeping my eyes fixed on the grass, but he was like a persistent mosquito. Eventually, he'd march over, waving his hand to get me to shut off the engine. The engine would sputter and die down to a quiet, ticking idle. Arthur would look down his nose at me and say, his voice dripping with patronizing pity as he pointed at my walkway, "You know, they make electric edgers nowadays. It really helps define the borders. I'd be happy to loan you mine, you know, so you can join the rest of civilization." I watched the subtle, self-satisfied smirk on his face, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped his hips. I just nod, offer a dry, "Thanks, Arthur," and pull the cord to start the engine again. But ignore a mosquito long enough, and it'll eventually draw blood. Arthur's passive, aggressive remarks soon morphed into something far more sinister. He began weaponizing the local county government. I started receiving official envelopes in my mailbox, red-bordered warning letters from county code enforcement. I was cited for uncontrolled vegetation, exceeding local height limits, and improper exterior storage of property maintenance equipment. I looked out my front window and saw Arthur standing by his pristine hedges, holding a digital camera with a telephoto lens, taking photos of my driveway. The county inspectors told me they were legally obligated to investigate every complaint. It was a slow, toxic drip of harassment. I felt violated in my own home, constantly watched, waiting for the next fine, the next knock on the door. I realized then that psychologists have a word for people like Arthur: projection. He had no control over his own fading significance in the world, so he sought to conquer mine, and I realized something else too. Ignoring him was no longer an option. It was time to give Arthur exactly what he wanted: a lawn that required his absolute, undivided attention. When a man invades your peace, your biological instinct is to fight back loudly. You want to march across the asphalt, slam the threatening letter against his chest, and scream until your vocal cords fray. Looking back, I realized that was exactly what Arthur was hoping for. Toxic, bureaucratic personalities thrive on negative friction. An argument would have validated him. It would have proven that his self-appointed authority had weight, that he had successfully gotten under my skin. So, I denied him the satisfaction. I looked up from the warning letter, caught Arthur staring at me through the leaves of his pristine ficus, and gave him a warm, neighborly wave. His clippers froze mid-snip, his brow furrowed in sheer confusion. The smug satisfaction slowly drains from his face, replaced by a twitch of deep, unresolved frustration. I didn't get angry. I got calculated. The catalyst for my retaliation arrived a week later, when my sister asked me to watch her 2 golden retrievers for a month. Barnaby and Bella were wonderful, energetic creatures with coats like thick, spun silk. Every afternoon, I bypassed the paved roads and took them deep into the abandoned county nature reserve, a sprawling, unmanaged acreage of tall grasses, wild riverbanks, and dense, untamed brush. They'd run through the thickets, splashing through the muddy creek, living in absolute, uninhibited joy. And every evening, when we returned to my garage, I would sit on a wooden stool with a wire brush and patiently groom the wilderness out of their fur. It was during one of these grooming sessions that I truly looked at what I was brushing out. Hundreds of persistent little hitchhikers, specifically Desmodium canadense, commonly known as showy tick trefoil, and Xanthium strumarium, the common cocklebur. I sat there in the dim light of my garage, holding one of the spiky burrs in the palm of my hand. I didn't toss it into the trash can. Instead, I set it carefully on my workbench, opened my laptop, and began to read. If you are going to wage a psychological war against a man who treats his turf like a holy sanctuary, you cannot rely on amateur weaponry. You don't buy commercial weed seeds from a garden center. Those are easily killed by the standard pre-emergent herbicides Arthur sprayed every spring. No, you use nature's ultimate. Unyielding survivalists. I learned that wild cockleburs and tick trefoil are botanical masterpieces of pure spite. They possess thick, woody taproots that drive deep into the earth. They actively thrive in well-aerated, heavily irrigated, nitrogen-rich soil, which described Arthur's Gulf, coarse lawn to absolute perfection. Furthermore, because of their complex vascular biology, broadleaf chemical poisons often fail to kill the root system. If you try to poison them, The grass around them dies while the weed simply drinks the fertilizer and spreads. If you try to pull them out by hand, the deep taproot snaps off beneath the surface, practically guaranteeing it will regrow doubly aggressive within days. To remove them permanently, you have to dig deep into the grading, leaving massive, unsightly craters in the flat turf. They weren't just weeds. They were a biological insurgency. For the next 3 weeks, my daily routine took on a monk-like devotion. I walked the dogs through the densest patches of the reserve. I brought them home, I brushed them, and I harvested my quiet crop, filling glass mason jars to the brim with thousands of brown, spiky burrs. By day, I maintained my facade of the clueless, slightly incompetent neighbor. I'd intentionally walk over to the property line while Arthur was edging, holding a bag of cheap lawn food, asking him earnestly if he thought the blue stuff or the green stuff was better for soil pH. I watched him swell with narcissistic pride as he lectured me for 20 minutes on soil chemistry, utterly oblivious to the fact that the very hands I was using to take his advice were stained with the sap of his impending doom. The dramatic irony was intoxicating. He thought he was civilizing a peasant. He didn't realize the peasant was simply measuring the battlefield. The delivery system was deceptively simple. I waited for the late spring rains, those warm, humid nights when the soil is soft, receptive, and practically begging for life. Under the cover of a moonless midnight, I went for my walks. I wore dark, unremarkable clothing and walked with a slow, leisurely stride, looking like a man simply clearing his head before sleep. But with every step along the edge of Arthur's property, my hand dipped into my pocket, releasing a steady, silent shower of cocklebur and clover seeds into the damp grass. I was precise. I didn't just toss them randomly. I targeted the crown jewels of his estate, the razor-sharp edges of his pristine flower beds, the soft soil directly surrounding his underground sprinkler heads, and the hard, to-reach corners near his expensive geometric shrubbery where a lawnmower blade couldn't easily reach. Arthur's own automatic irrigation system, which he ran every morning at 5 like clockwork, would do the rest. He was going to water his own destruction. 2 weeks later, the trap sprung. I sat on my porch with my morning coffee, watching Arthur perform his daily perimeter check. He stopped dead in his tracks near his favorite hydrangeas. I watched the color drain from his face as his fingers tightened around his clipboard until his knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. There, nestled perfectly in his sacred turf, were several jagged, thick-leaved sprouts of wild cocklebur. Arthur didn't panic yet. He smiled his arrogant, accountant's smile, walked to his garage, and emerged with a heavy-duty container of selective broadleaf herbicide. He gave each weed a generous, vindictive spray. He thought that was the end of it. He didn't realize he was dealing with wild, evolutionary masterpieces. The herbicide did exactly what I knew it would do. It soaked into the soil, but the hardy, deep-rooted cockleburs simply absorbed the chemicals, slowed their growth for a day, and then kept climbing. Meanwhile, the delicate, over-fertilized Kentucky bluegrass surrounding the weeds couldn't handle the chemical overload. Within days, Arthur didn't have dead weeds. He had giant, vibrant green weeds surrounded by ugly, rotting yellow halos of dead grass. That was when the obsession took hold. Arthur abandoned his specialized mower attachments. The pristine, alternating stripes vanished, replaced by an increasingly chaotic patchwork of bare dirt and towering, jagged weeds. He resorted to manual extraction. He spent hours on his knees digging. But because the taproots of the tick, trefoil, are incredibly deep and brittle, they snapped off beneath the surface. For every weed Arthur pulled, 3 more erupted from the fractured root system a week later. By the 3rd week, his life was completely consumed. I'd look out my window at dusk and see him standing in his driveway, holding a flashlight, staring blankly at his front yard like a defeated general staring at a map of a lost war. He stopped washing his car. He stopped yelling at me about my walkway. One afternoon, as I was casually loading some groceries into my car, I saw him on his knees, frantically clawing at a patch of dirt. I leaned over my car door, keeping my voice perfectly polite, warm, and entirely devoid of malice. "Morning, Arthur," I called out. "Everything okay over there? You look like you've got some stubborn patches. Let me know if you want to borrow my old mower. To help you get a handle on things." Arthur slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were hollow, shadowed with exhaustion. He didn't speak, he just stared, a broken man holding a handful of dirt, realizing his empire had crumbled. The climax of Arthur's tragedy did not arrive with a loud, dramatic confrontation. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a man wearing a high-visibility vest and a hard hat. It was the very same county code inspector whom Arthur had sent to my house multiple times over the preceding weeks. Only this time, he wasn't looking at my driveway. He was staring at the disaster zone across the street. To say Arthur's yard was a mess would be an understatement. In his manic attempt to eradicate my quiet crop, he had dug dozens of ragged, deep craters into his once perfect lawn. To make matters worse, in his desperation, he had purchased industrial-grade agricultural defoliants online, poisons never meant for residential use, and sprayed them so heavily that he had chemically scorched half his property. The runoff had bled into the public drainage ditch, leaving a trail of withered, blackened vegetation. Arthur stood on his porch, his clothes wrinkled, his hair disheveled, waving his arms wildly as he tried to explain himself. But the inspector was simply shaking his head, writing furiously on his pad. The very system Arthur had tried to weaponize against his neighbors had turned its sights on him. He was cited for illegal chemical runoff, soil erosion, and harboring invasive weeds. His credibility with the county was entirely ruined. He was no longer the model citizen reporting the neighborhood anarchists. He was the neighborhood nuisance. It took a professional landscaping crew 5 days and cost Arthur thousands of dollars to completely scrape, re-excavate, and re-sod his yard. For a week, his house looked like an archaeological dig. When they finally laid down the fresh, sterile rolls of new turf, Arthur didn't come out to inspect it. He didn't stand at the property line to watch me mow. In fact, he rarely looked in my direction at all anymore. When he did, his eyes quickly darted away, filled with a quiet, hollow defeat. He had been thoroughly, legally, and quietly humbled. Looking back on it, I don't feel a wild, triumphant joy. What I feel is a profound, quiet stillness. There is a profound irony in how we define justice. We are taught by movies and books to look for dramatic confrontations, screaming matches, courtroom battles, or burning bridges. But the most devastating consequences are almost always the ones we cultivate ourselves. When Arthur started his campaign of harassment 3 months ago, he believed he had won. He thought he was the ultimate authority, and that I was just another weak homeowner who would eventually bend to his will. He didn't realize that the quiet people he targeted wouldn't scream or fight back with predictable anger. He never expected them to simply walk away, leaving a silent, ticking clock buried in his soil. Sometimes, the best thing you can do with your anger is to plant it, walk away, and let nature do the weeding. But sometimes, you don't have to wait 3 long months for the silent seeds of arrogance to bloom. Sometimes, the scales of the universe are balanced in a single afternoon, in a pristine, glass-walled luxury car dealership halfway across the country. If you want to see what happened when an insufferably arrogant sales manager tried to humiliate a quiet, overall clad mechanic who wanted to buy a vehicle in cash, only to realize he had just insulted his owner's silent partner and triggered a massive, multi-million-dollar audit, click on the video on your screen right now. I'll see you there.